Hey, my name is Austin Black, and I want to talk about this little camera, the Sony FDR-X3000. So Sony loses a few points initially just for the name of this thing. FDR-X3000's not really the type of name that rolls off the tongue. But I spent a lot of time deliberating between this camera and the GoPro Hero 5 and the Y+. And I chose this camera and I'm very happy with it, and I'm here to tell you why I chose this and why I think you should choose it. And I'm just going to preface this by saying the main reason you should choose this camera is the image stabilization, the B.O.S.S, the balanced optical steady shot. It is amazing with this camera. Like, I have the Sony a6500, which has optical stabilization, but I find that the stabilization in this little guy is even better than the a6500. And that affects just about everything with this camera. I mean, really, it's the most important thing to have with an action camera. It affects the image quality. So the GoPro Hero 5 and the Yi 4K might have a comparable just image if you have it set up on a tripod, but actually in the field, if you have it mounted on a skateboard, you're gonna love the footage much more on this camera, and it's gonna look better in low light. The Yi and the GoPro use an electronic stabilizer, which is basically the same thing that any of your editing softwares, your Premiere, your Final Cut, they can all do that. So you can do that on top of this optical stabilization. Apply warp stabilizer in Premiere, and you're doing the same thing that the GoPro does. Plus, you have the sensor on this floating thing that keeps it steady. It's really amazing technology. So for me, the main things I was looking for in an action camera was something that was rugged, something that could go underwater, and something that I could use as another camera to shoot time lapses. And this does all of those things better than the other two options. Now, one thing the GoPro has that I wish this Sony had, the GoPro, you can take it underwater without the housing. I wish you could do that with the Sony, but you can't. You have to have this underwater housing, and if you have the underwater housing on, you're not going to get very good audio. Now, for me personally, I don't use this camera for audio at all, but some of you that might, that could affect it, because I tend to leave this housing on all the time just because I feel like it protects it from shock a little bit more, and obviously I can take it underwater at a moment's notice. I've had this thing fall off skateboards, I've dropped this thing, I've been very rough with this camera so far, and it's held up great. I haven't noticed anything. The plastic in this housing is really strong, so I just like to leave it on. Another cool thing with this camera is it has a microphone in, a 3.5mm microphone input here, so you can connect a microphone like the Rode Video Micro to this camera and have it on a handle and have a pretty nice vlogging rig. If you're vlogging on a budget, I'd almost prefer this camera over the RX100 Mark V. Now, the RX100 Mark V is going to have a little bit better image quality and better low light, but this has better stabilization, plus that audio is so valuable, and it's smaller. So that's another thing to keep in mind with this. I would be comfortable using this for a vlog. And one thing that was a little bit of a disappointment to me, you can only change the angle of view in 1080p. So Sony gives you the option of wide, medium, and narrow field of view, and you can only change it in 1080p. So if you're shooting in 4K, you've got to use that wide mode. And you know what? Largely, that's okay. The distortion isn't that bad. It doesn't look like a crappy GoPro thing. Like, it looks good. Next thing I want to talk about is the battery life. This camera uses the same battery as the RX100 Mark V, and I find it lasts way longer than the RX100 Mark V does, since you don't have the monitor, you don't have a lot of the processing that the RX100 Mark V has. I've never had an issue with the battery life. I think a battery will last me about a day, maybe 2 batteries a day, but no more than that. And I've shot on it a pretty good amount. So the next thing I want to talk about is the slow motion. It shoots 1080p at 120 frames per second. It shoots 720p at 240 frames per second, I believe. Same as the GoPro. I've used it. It's nice. It's exactly like what you'd find in the a6500 or RX100. It's just slow motion. I tend to shoot everything in 4K unless I know for a fact I'm going to be slowing that down. I would have liked 4K 60 like the Yi, but the optical stabilization in this camera just made it worthwhile to get this instead of the Yi. Another kind of downer with this camera is the fact that it doesn't have a monitor. Sony kind of wants you to buy this weird wristwatch that has a monitor on it that connects via Wi-Fi. And I really don't like that. I'm not gonna spend an extra $100 on a stupid gimmicky watch that I don't even think you can take it underwater. So what I use is I use the app on my phone, connect to Wi-Fi, and I can monitor the shot if I need to. A lot of the time you can get a sense of if you're safe or not. You know, it's wide enough, so if you're doing this, you know pretty well that you're gonna be in the shot. Now, if you're doing a time lapse, I do take the time and get my phone out. And on something like a GoPro or a Yi, you don't have to worry about that because they have a touchscreen on the back with a display. So that's something I would have really liked with this camera that it doesn't have. Another thing that Sony doesn't have on the GoPro is just features. GoPro has a ton of features, a lot of which I don't even need, like GoPro, record. I don't really need that. I think, you know, just record, change the modes. One thing GoPro has that I would like to see in this is better time-lapse features. The GoPro will actually compile your photos into a time-lapse video file. I kind of like doing it myself most of the time, but some people might like having the video, so it's important to note. And then finally, I just want to kind of talk about the ergonomics of this thing because it's definitely different than your run-of-the-mill action camera. The Yi and the GoPro are both kind of these cube shapes. It's like a cylindrical thing with the lens right here. And it fits in your pocket pretty nicely unless you have this lens cover on here. It'll still fit, but it might be just a little bit awkward. I don't mind this like ergonomically, but some people might prefer the GoPro just because it's probably easier to put in a pocket. It's easier to take with you. So overall, I just think this camera has it where it counts in image quality, stabilization, low light. The Yi 4K Plus has 4K 60, which is really nice, but it doesn't make sense. The optical stabilization in this camera, I think, really makes up for not having 4K 60. I would definitely buy this camera again. I don't need all the crazy features that GoPro has. This, for me, is what I think will give me the best results and what I think is going to be the best for me to use. So let me know what you think. Let me know what action camera you have. Let me know what action camera you prefer. This is just my opinion, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.